The bullies had no idea that the black boy they looked down on was actually carrying the bloodline of a notorious Mafia hitman. They thought he was the perfect prey, weak, silent, and unwilling to fight back. They humiliated, discriminated, and pushed him to the bottom without thinking of the consequences. But sometimes, silence isn't weakness, it's the final warning. Today, you will hear the story of Jamal Moretti, a boy everyone underestimated, but who carried the legacy of Lorenzo the Reaper Moretti, a feared Mafia hitman. They thought they could humiliate him, but this time they chose the wrong person. Westwood High had unwritten rules, survival of the fittest. Here, you're either a predator or prey. The rulers always find someone to make an example of, to ridicule, to assert their dominance. Every year, a new weakling appears, becoming the target of humiliation and cruelty. This year, that person was Jamal Moretti, the only black boy in the class, quiet, reserved, with no friends. He was an outsider, a perfect target. Dylan Carter, the leader of the bullying group, saw it from the first day. He smirked when he saw Jamal walking down the hallway, head down, not reacting to the whispers behind his back. He didn't hesitate. A kid like that would never fight back. But Dylan didn't know he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. What would happen if the person you bully every day holds a secret that could destroy your life? Jamal Moretti wasn't weak. He wasn't someone who would stay silent forever. He was the grandson of Lorenzo the Reaper Moretti, one of the most ruthless Mafia hitmen in Italy. And there was one thing the Moretti family never taught their children: how to forgive. Anyone who stepped into Westwood High understood one thing: it was not a place for the weak. That was an unspoken rule, a power game where only the strong could make the rules. And Dylan Carter was one of them. Since middle school, Dylan had known how to maintain his position at the top. Not with grades or sports achievements, but with fear. He didn't need to fight to gain power. Just a look, a tone of voice, and a little cruelty was enough to make anyone bow their head when walking past him. Westwood was his kingdom, and like every ruler, he needed someone to put down to maintain order. Then Jamal Moretti walked into the school. He wasn't loud, he didn't draw attention. Just another stranger among curious eyes. A black boy, thin, calm, wearing a faded black hoodie and plain jeans. Not the type to try to fit in or assert himself. He was the kind of person the hunters could spot immediately. Dylan saw that from the first moment. He watched Jamal walk down the hallway, his steps steady but slightly hesitant, his head slightly down, not looking directly at anyone. No challenging glance, no reaction to the whispers behind him. That was a sign of weakness. Dylan pursed his lips, a slight smirk on his face. He had found his new amusement. His group, Brandon, Kyle, and Sean, stood around, watching Dylan's reaction with quiet excitement. They'd been playing this game for too long to not recognize the signs when Dylan found a new target. Brandon, the biggest in the group, nudged Dylan, smiling. "He looks interesting, doesn't he?" Kyle, the most outspoken, crossed his arms, watching Jamal sit at the back of the class thoughtfully. "I don't think he'll react. Just look at him. He's got to be some broke, nerdy loser." Sean, the youngest in the group, shrugged. "Could be, but who knows? I'd love to see how long he lasts." Dylan didn't say anything, just continued to watch Jamal. There was something different about him, but he didn't care. All he saw was a weak, lonely, and completely powerless kid, and that's all he needed. Dylan Carter always had one rule: if you're weak, you're the target, and Jamal Moretti officially became his prey. At Westwood, people like Dylan Carter don't just bully for fun. They do it because it's how they maintain an order that they believe they have the right to impose. An underground system exists where the strong trample on the weak, and the weak must accept their place if they don't want to be crushed. Every year, someone always becomes the target. Someone is turned into a joke, shoved, humiliated, just to maintain that twisted order. Dylan is not just the leader of the bullies. He is the one who determines who belongs where, who has the right to hold their head high, and who must remain silent and endure. That day, when Dylan walked into the cafeteria, he knew exactly what he was going to do. From a distance, he saw Jamal sitting alone in the corner of the room, not talking to anyone, not touching anyone. A simple tray of food sat in front of him, his eyes silently looking down, completely indifferent to the world around him. The way Jamal separated himself bothered Dylan. He wasn't trying to make friends, he wasn't trying to fit in, but he wasn't showing fear or worry either. He simply existed, quietly, as if no one could touch him. And that's what irritated Dylan, because to him, no one had the right to ignore the order he had established. Without hesitation, Dylan grabbed his tray of food and signaled to Brandon, Kyle, and Sean to follow. The three of them understood what he was about to do without needing to ask. Brandon smirked, Kyle shoved his hands into his pockets, and Sean merely smiled, his eyes glinting with amusement as he watched someone else being humiliated. They walked past the tables where dozens of other students were eating, laughing. But gradually, more and more people started to notice as Dylan and his group moved in one direction. Some students began whispering to each other. A few cast discreet glances and turned away, but no one had any intention of intervening. No one ever intervenes when Dylan decides to target someone. He stopped right in front of Jamal's table. For a moment, the boy looked up, but not to look at Dylan, just a quick glance, as though he had already sensed his presence. Dylan didn't say anything, didn't greet or taunt him. He simply grabbed Jamal's tray and flipped it upside down onto the floor. A sharp, dry crash echoed. The scrambled eggs fell. Ketchup splattered across the white tiles. Bread and potatoes tumbled, creating a mess right at Jamal's feet. The once loud cafeteria suddenly quieted down. Some students glanced over, others intentionally turned away as though they hadn't seen what was happening. Dylan's group all held their breath, waiting for a reaction from the person sitting in front of them. Jamal remained seated, his gaze focused on the spilled food without showing any anger or embarrassment. He didn't yell, didn't jump up to protest, and didn't try to provoke anything. He simply stayed silent. Dylan tilted his head, smirking. "Oh, sorry, kid, didn't see you there." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but his eyes were full of contempt. Jamal said nothing. He bent down, picked up the tray, carefully wiped off the leftover food from the table and set it back down as it was. Then he slowly stood up, took the tray, and walked towards the trash can, not a word of protest. Not a sharp glare, just silence. Unbearable silence. Dylan blinked. He didn't expect Jamal to react like that. He was waiting for an outburst, a weak resistance, some curse words, but there was nothing. The way Jamal silently accepted it made him feel like he had just thrown a punch into the air, with no resistance, no satisfaction in seeing someone hurt or angry. It was as if Jamal didn't care. Brandon burst out laughing, breaking the silence. "What? Not going to say anything?" His voice echoed through the cafeteria, making some of the students around turn to look. "How long are you going to stay quiet?" Kyle raised an eyebrow. Sean shook his head, his laugh dripping with mockery. "Just a cowardly little kid." Jamal kept walking, not turning around, but as he reached the trash can, Kyle stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "What are you doing here?" he asked, glaring at Jamal in defiance. "This school isn't for you." The group erupted in laughter, the mockery not only stemming from the prank they just pulled, but from the real contempt in their words. This wasn't just ordinary bullying. This was racism. Westwood had never had a black student hold a high position in the school social hierarchy. Here, people like Jamal were just outsiders. People that rich white kids like Dylan believed could never touch their position. Dylan didn't just want to humiliate Jamal. He wanted him to understand that he didn't belong here. But even when blocked, Jamal didn't react. He simply looked at Kyle for a second, then gently stepped aside, slipping past him without saying a word. Kyle stood there, momentarily frozen, unsure of what to do with that response. Dylan gritted his teeth. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had been expecting a fierce reaction, an explosion, something to prove that he had succeeded in crushing someone beneath his feet. But Jamal didn't retaliate, didn't throw back any harsh words, didn't try to prove anything. That frustrated Dylan more than ever. But he didn't stop. "Hey, kid," Dylan called out loudly as Jamal was walking out of the cafeteria. "What are you going to do next? Run to the teacher to tattle? Or are you just going to stay quiet and endure until you can't take it anymore?" Jamal still didn't turn around. He just kept walking, his old sneakers tapping on the cold floor. And when the cafeteria door closed behind him, Dylan realized he had just found a new game. Jamal wasn't reacting. Fine. He would keep going until Jamal couldn't stay silent any longer. What Dylan didn't know was that, in that moment, he had stepped into a battle he could never win. Jamal did not look back when the cafeteria door closed behind him. He walked away with an inexplicable calmness, as if what had just happened wasn't important enough to concern him. But right behind that door, Dylan Carter and his gang were still watching. He didn't feel satisfied, didn't feel victorious like he had in the past when he brought someone down. Instead, a strange feeling crept into his mind. Discomfort. A silence he couldn't control. Jamal hadn't fought back. He didn't show any anger. He didn't tremble or cry. He simply walked away as if what had just happened meant nothing to him. That was something Dylan couldn't accept. And so, he decided to take things to another level. In the days that followed, Jamal's life at Westwood became a continuous string of humiliations, carefully orchestrated by Dylan and his cronies. People like Dylan didn't just want to humiliate someone once and let it go. He wanted to erode their endurance, watch them crumble piece by piece, and push them to their absolute limits. Every day, they found a new way to degrade Jamal even more. On Monday morning, as Jamal walked through the crowded hallway, Dylan suddenly stuck his foot out. Jamal stumbled, lost his balance, and his body crashed forward. Laughter immediately erupted from Dylan's group. Some other students laughed too, not because they hated Jamal, but because of the cowardice of the crowd. Everyone wanted to side with the stronger one. Jamal pushed his hands to the floor, slowly stood up, brushed the dust off his clothes, and continued walking without saying a word. Dylan watched his every move, trying to find a sign of anger, frustration, or any trace of pain on Jamal's face, but there was nothing. Just an eerie silence. On Tuesday morning, Jamal opened his locker and saw a sloppy, bright red message scrawled on the door. "Get back to where you belong." Next to it was a crude symbol of a burned cross, a familiar sign of racial hatred. Some students nearby saw the scene, but no one spoke up. A few whispered, a few turned away, but no one intervened. At Westwood, silence was the safest choice. Jamal stared at the message for a few seconds, then opened his locker, grabbed his books as usual, and closed the door, as if he hadn't seen anything. Dylan, standing a few steps away, folded his arms and observed. He had been expecting a reaction, anger, a complaint, a sign of pain on Jamal's face, but there was nothing. Jamal just kept walking. On Wednesday, when Jamal opened his backpack in class, a foul odor immediately hit him. He opened the small inner pocket and found a rotten banana, its juice leaking all over his books. Giggles came from the back of the class. Kyle nudged Sean, his voice full of amusement. "Guess he misses the smell of home?" Brandon pretended to frown and held his nose as if he couldn't stand the stench. God, I thought this was a school, not a zoo. The whole group burst into laughter. Some other students laughed too, not because they agreed, but because they wanted to side with the stronger one to avoid becoming the next target. Jamal carefully took a tissue, wrapped the banana up, and threw it in the trash. He opened his books, examined the stained pages, then silently tore off the damaged parts and continued writing. No one could understand why he kept his calm. On Thursday, they took the game to a new level. When Jamal was writing in math class, a ripping sound came from behind him. He turned around and saw his notebook torn into pieces, falling to the floor. Dylan held half of the notebook in his hand, smirking challengingly. "What do you need to study for?" He sneered. "Who would hire you to work anyway?" Kyle laughed, lightly patting Dylan on the back as if he had just said something profoundly true. Sean shook his head mockingly, and Brandon just crossed his arms, grinning. The whole class went silent. No one intervened. Jamal looked at the torn papers at his feet. His notes, his assignments, all were ruined. He looked into Dylan's eyes for a brief moment. A gaze without fear, without anger, just simple observation. Then he bent down, picked up the pieces of paper, and neatly arranged them as if it were the most normal thing in the world. On Friday, Dylan and his gang began to lose patience. No one could endure continuous humiliation without reacting. No one could stay silent without a burst of resentment. But Jamal was different. He was like a stone wall. Nothing could shake him. Dylan didn't understand. Why wasn't he afraid? Why wasn't he losing his mind? Why wasn't he begging? Unable to take it anymore, Dylan stepped in front of Jamal during lunch, blocking his path right in the middle of the crowded cafeteria. "What game are you playing?" Dylan growled, his eyes flashing with both anger and confusion. Jamal looked up at him, his gaze calm. No fear, no anger, just slow observation. A faint smile crossed his lips. "You'll see." Just those few words. And for the first time since this game began, Dylan felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know it yet, but from that moment on, the roles between the predator and the prey had started to reverse. When the bedroom door gently closed behind him, Jamal let his backpack fall to the floor without bothering to open it. He didn't need to check his books anymore. No need to clean up either. The torn pages, the smeared writing from water, the assignments that were no longer intact. He knew that tomorrow there would be another joke, another humiliation, and then another joke after that. Those days would not stop until he did something. But what good would simple resistance do? He had seen too many people fall into his position. They went crazy, they screamed, they struggled. And that only entertained people like Dylan more. Bullies like him didn't need a reason to torment someone. They just needed a reaction. Anger, fear, defeat. And Jamal wasn't going to give them that. He sat down on the floor, leaned against the bedpost, his eyes silently staring at the wall in front of him. On it, a faded old picture frame sat on a wooden shelf. He reached out and took the picture down. In the photo, a man stood in front of a sleek black Cadillac. He looked tall, his posture solid like a tower, dressed in a neat black suit, a loose tie around his neck as if he had just stepped out of a tense meeting. A half-burnt cigarette dangled between his rough fingers, while his other hand gripped a gun tightly. Behind him was a dark alley, where the dim streetlights were not enough to illuminate what had happened within. Lorenzo Moretti. His nickname in the underworld didn't need explaining. The Reaper. Jamal's grandfather wasn't a regular man. He had known that for a long time, from the hushed stories shared among the adults in the family, from the times his mother tried to hide the truth whenever he asked about him. He had heard the warnings, the advice not to dig too deep, that it was better to forget about the past. But how could he forget when his grandfather's lessons were so deeply ingrained in his mind? Jamal closed his eyes. Lorenzo's deep voice echoed from the past, reverberating like a background soundtrack that Jamal had heard over and over throughout his childhood. Kid, in this life, you'll meet many types of people. But the worst ones aren't the strong ones. They're the little punks who think they have the right to trample others. When they think they've won, that's when you strike. Jamal knew his grandfather wasn't talking about petty one-on-one fights or foolish revenge. Lorenzo Moretti didn't need to use his fists to teach someone a lesson. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to scream. When he wanted someone to know they had made a mistake, they would realize it, in the scariest way possible. Jamal once thought he could stay away from that legacy. He had once believed that as long as he kept quiet, things would pass. But now he understood that didn't work. If Dylan and his group wanted a game, then he would give them one. But not in the way they expected. Jamal put the photo down. He stood up, walked over to the desk near the window, and pulled out the small drawer underneath. Inside, among notebooks and dull pencils, there was a small object lying quietly at the bottom. A small dagger, its shiny steel blade, its leather-wrapped handle worn with time. A gift from Lorenzo on his 13th birthday. At that time, his mother had been so angry she nearly threw it in the trash. "My son will not grow up in that darkness," his mother had said to him. But Lorenzo just laughed. "A knife isn't for killing," he had said, placing it in Jamal's hand, allowing him to feel its weight. "It's to remind you that power doesn't lie in the weapon, but in the one who knows how to use it." Jamal lightly turned the blade between his fingers. The light from his nightstand lamp reflected off the metal surface, flashing a cold glint. He didn't intend to use it. He didn't need to use it. But tonight, he would begin. He closed the drawer and looked out the window. The endless night sky stretched across. The distant streetlights reflected on the wet road. Dylan Carter thought he was in control of everything. He thought he could step on anyone whenever he pleased without consequences. But he was wrong. His game would end. Jamal just needed to make him realize that, in a way that he would never forget. When the sun rises, the hunt will begin. When the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, Jamal was ready. There was no anger, no rush, only absolute calmness. He had calculated everything, step by step, without a single mistake. This was not just a simple act of revenge, this was a warning. People like Dylan Carter were not defeated through violence. He had spent his life controlling others, making the weaker ones bow before him. To defeat him, you couldn't just fight back. Jamal understood that. He didn't need to touch Dylan, he just needed to let him destroy himself. Dylan woke up with a sense of discomfort. He had a restless sleep. In his mind, the voice of Jamal from yesterday in the cafeteria still echoed. A simple statement, yet it made him feel uneasy. "You'll see." He didn't understand why it bothered him. Just some cowardly kid who wouldn't stand up for himself. He had met countless people like that, and none of them could do anything but endure. But something wasn't right. He reached for his phone on the table. When he unlocked the screen, he froze. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. No name, no information, just a single line of text. "I'm watching you." Dylan furrowed his brow. He looked around the room, then out the window. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. This had to be a joke. Maybe Kyle or Sean was trying to mess with him. He shook his head, put his phone down, and got ready for school, but that strange feeling wouldn't leave him. The hallways of Westwood High this morning were no different from any other day. Groups of students gathered, chatting, exchanging homework, or simply gossiping. But at the far corner of the hallway, Ryan, one of Dylan's close associates, stood frozen in front of his locker. As soon as he opened the locker door, a photo fell out. A photo of himself, sleeping in his bedroom. Ryan felt a chill run through his body. How could this be? He stared at the photo, his heart pounding. This couldn't be a prank from anyone in the group. No one could have gotten into his room, let alone taken a picture without him knowing. On the back of the photo, there was a small but sharp, handwritten message. "Do you think you're safe?" Ryan swallowed hard. He looked around, trying to spot who might be watching him. But everyone in the hallway was going about their usual business. No one was looking his way. But someone was watching him. Someone had entered his room. Someone had left this warning. In the first class of the day, Kyle put his backpack on the desk, unzipped it, and was about to take out his books. But as soon as he opened the flap, everything inside was completely messed up. All of his books were gone. Instead, there were only blank sheets of paper, oddly arranged. Nothing was written on them, except for a line of text on the first sheet, "Who's the weak one now?" Kyle blinked. His heart raced. This wasn't normal. Someone had rifled through his backpack. But how? He had carried it with him all morning, had placed it under the desk. No one could have touched it without him noticing. He turned his head and looked around the classroom. No one seemed to be paying attention to him. But someone had done this. He didn't know how, but he could feel it. Someone was watching him. Dylan, Ryan, Kyle, and Sean gathered near the parking lot during break. None of them had the smug looks from yesterday. "I swear someone was in my room," Ryan said, his voice trembling, still clutching the photo in his jacket pocket. "Are you sure?" Sean asked, but his eyes showed the same worry. "I'm sure, and it's not just me. Kyle, someone rifled through your backpack, right?" Kyle gritted his teeth. "Yeah, and I swear no one could have done that without me knowing. But it happened." Dylan stayed silent. He could see the worry in each of their eyes. No one said it, but everyone knew this wasn't just a normal prank. This wasn't normal. Dylan didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to admit that someone had infiltrated their lives in this way. But he couldn't deny the undeniable truth forming in his mind. Someone was controlling this game, and this time they were not the ones in control. Jamal didn't need to get closer to see their reactions. He sat at the end of the hallway, his book open in his hands, but his eyes still watching every movement of Dylan's group. He could see how they whispered, how their eyes scanned the crowd with unease, how their shoulders were tense. They were scared, not because of what had happened, but because they didn't understand what was going on. And that was exactly the point. No punches, no yelling, no cursing. Just planting a single question in their minds. Who's doing this? When a bully loses their certainty, when they start doubting even the most familiar things, they are no longer strong. They will destroy themselves. Jamal was simply helping them realize that. And this was just the beginning. Dylan Carter walked into school the next morning with dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. All night, he had been jolted awake by nightmares he couldn't remember the details of. But as soon as he woke up, a chilling feeling clung to him, as if someone was watching him from the shadows. Dylan wasn't the type to be scared easily. He had spent his life threatening others. Never once had anyone made him feel uneasy. But this time, things were out of his control, and he hated it. But his real nightmare had only just begun. When Dylan entered the schoolyard, he immediately sensed something was wrong. A group of students was gathered in the parking lot, whispering to each other, some even pointing. He frowned and walked faster. As he got closer, he saw his car. A shiny black Dodge Charger, blaring its alarm. The siren screeched loudly, causing the entire parking lot to shake with the continuous beeping. He quickly pulled out his keys, pressed the button to turn it off, and the noise stopped instantly. Dylan gritted his teeth. Someone had touched his car, but there were no signs of anyone around. No signs of tampering, no suspicious footprints. So, who triggered the alarm? He shook his head, trying to calm himself. It could just be a technical glitch, but deep inside, a vague sense of unease crept in. Was this just a coincidence? He didn't know yet, but this was only the beginning. Ryan sat in class, his eyes darting back and forth from left to right. Today, he couldn't focus on anything. Every time he walked through the hallways, he felt like someone was following him, silently watching each step he took. But when he turned around, no one was there. He tried to look through the classroom window, scanning the schoolyard, the hallway outside, every little corner. But still, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He shook his head, trying to concentrate on the lesson. But as he bent down to write, a shiver ran down his spine. A shadow was reflected on the phone screen on his desk. Ryan jumped, spinning around. There was no one behind him. His heart raced. He knew someone was watching him. But how? He felt like he was being hunted. And that made the fear inside him grow. During science class, Sean opened the small drawer beneath his desk to grab his books. But as soon as he pulled it open, he froze. Inside, there was an old dagger. The wooden handle, the blade worn down a little with time, but still sharp. Sean couldn't breathe. Someone had put it there. Right next to the dagger was a small folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he picked it up and unfolded it. A simple line, written in sharp, cold handwriting, with no hint of urgency. "Do you know what it feels like to be hunted?" Sean shuddered. He felt like the whole room had frozen. He glanced around the classroom trying to figure out who had put this in his drawer. But no one was looking at him. No one seemed like the kind of person who would do this. He clenched the paper in his hand, his heart pounding. Someone was sending a message, and he didn't like it one bit. After lunch, the group gathered in the old gym, a place few people passed through. Dylan, Ryan, Kyle, and Sean were all there. None of them were laughing or chatting like usual. Dylan spoke first, his voice cold as ice. "Which one of you did this?" No one answered. "I'm not joking. Don't mess with me like this." Ryan stared at Dylan, panic clear in his eyes. "I swear I didn't do it, but someone is watching me." Kyle nodded, his usual cocky attitude replaced by fear. "I don't know what the hell is going on. My backpack's been searched, my books are missing. I don't know how all this is happening without anyone noticing." Sean was still clutching the paper. He looked down at it, a feeling of fear rising in his throat. "You think, could it be Jamal?" A heavy silence filled the room. The group exchanged glances. No one wanted to say it, but they were all thinking the same thing. Jamal. Dylan gritted his teeth. He didn't believe it. He refused to believe that kid could be behind this. No way. But then a thought crept into his mind. What had Jamal said to him yesterday? "You'll see." Dylan clenched his fists. He had underestimated that kid. Maybe this was all just a prank. Maybe someone else was messing with them. But there was one thing he couldn't deny. The fear was spreading. And for the first time in his life, Dylan Carter began to feel like he wasn't the strongest anymore. Dylan Carter lay on the bed, the light from his phone screen casting an eerie glow on his tense face in the pitch-black room. The feeling of unease had clung to him since he left school, an invisible tension creeping into every thought, preventing his mind from settling. Throughout the day, the whispers and fearful glances of his friends had unsettled him. He knew Ryan was panicking over the photo taken in the bedroom. Kyle was startled by the blank sheets replacing all the books in his backpack. And Sean still couldn't describe the feeling when he saw the dagger appear in the desk drawer with that haunting note. But Dylan wasn't like them. He wouldn't let himself fall into vague fear. He had always been the one in control, the one who instilled fear, not the one being hunted. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to reassure himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that some force was closing in on him. Silent, invisible, but deadly. He exhaled deeply, trying to push away the distracting thoughts, and opened his phone to check his messages, a habit he couldn't break. His finger swiped across the screen until his gaze froze. At the very top, a new message appeared, with no phone number or sender's name, just one short sentence that held a terrifying weight. "Check under your car." A chill ran down Dylan's spine as he read those words. He sat up straight, eyes glued to the screen, his heart racing in an odd way. He had realized for some time that someone was trying to play a psychological game with him, but this was the first time a threat had been so direct. If this was a joke, then the person behind it was getting bolder. If it wasn't a joke, then that was even more terrifying. Dylan wasn't one to believe in coincidences. This message couldn't have appeared randomly. Someone wanted him to act. Someone wanted him to go outside right now. But despite knowing that, he couldn't resist the urge building in his chest. An invisible fear mixed with curiosity, with rage, with the need to control the situation. He stood up, threw on his hoodie, and quickly walked out of the room, heading toward the front door. Outside, the streetlights cast a sickly yellow glow over the parking lot, creating long, twisting shadows on the ground. The night air felt colder than usual, carrying an unsettling silence. Dylan scanned the area. There was no one on the road, no signs of anyone near his house. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, like an invisible shadow lurking in the dark. He walked toward his black Dodge Charger, eyes fixed on the ground as he crouched to check under the car. At first, all he saw was darkness, but then something stood out against the dull concrete. He froze. A black envelope was glued tightly under the car, near the front tire. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it, peeling the adhesive and lifting it up. It felt thin and light, but something hard was inside. He straightened up, fingers quickly tearing open the envelope and pulling out the only thing inside, a playing card, the ace of spades. Dylan stared at it. His eyes locked on the surface of the card as if he were searching for some hidden meaning. But then, when he flipped the card over, a short message, written in sharp, cold handwriting, hit him hard. "I warned you." His breath caught in his throat. He clenched the card in his hand, the coldness of it seeping into his skin. Someone had approached his car, had secretly slipped under it to attach this envelope. Someone had watched him long enough to know exactly when he would check his phone, when he would be compelled to step outside. Dylan gritted his teeth, his chest heaving with anger. Someone was trying to mess with him, but he wasn't the type to let anyone pull his strings like a puppet. If they thought they could scare him with a few messages and a stupid card, they were wrong. He shoved the card into his hoodie pocket, his eyes cold with determination. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to be afraid. If someone wanted to play, he would play to the end. But as he turned to head back into the house, a thought suddenly flashed in his mind, causing his steps to falter. Not just anyone could get close to his car without being noticed. Not just anyone could send a message at the perfect moment, making him do exactly what they wanted. Not just anyone could be patient enough to follow him for days, step by step, minute by minute, without slipping up. There was only one person at Westwood School smart enough, calm enough, and patient enough to do this. Jamal Moretti. His rage flared up again, but this time it was mixed with something else. Something he never thought he would feel. Fear. And the worst part was, for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do next. Dylan Carter felt his hand trembling as he gripped the old newspaper tightly, his fingers squeezing so hard that the pages, yellowed with age, crinkled under the pressure. He couldn't take his eyes off the photo on the front page, a black and white image, slightly blurry, yet still terrifyingly clear. A man stood in the middle of a dark alley, the dim streetlight reflecting off the black suit he was wearing. One hand held a half-burnt cigarette, the other firmly grasping a handgun, the barrel still smoking. Beneath his feet, a body lay motionless, eyes bulging in the final moments of panic in life. No caption was needed, just looking at the man's face made it clear that he was not someone anyone would dare confront. Lorenzo Moretti. The Reaper. Dylan swallowed hard, his breath growing heavier in his chest. That name wasn't unfamiliar to him. He had heard it before, in hushed conversations between older people, in the sensational news stories about the underground world everyone read, but no one dared openly discuss. A notorious assassin, the one believed to have carried out dozens of purges the police could never gather enough evidence to charge him for. A shadow haunting every gang, without the need for shouting or showing off power, for just the mention of his name was enough to make others too afraid to speak of him. He turned the page, his heart racing faster, as his eyes landed on another photo, smaller, but even more shocking. Next to Lorenzo, in a photo taken on a sunny afternoon, stood a child, quiet, neither too small nor old enough to understand the world they belonged to. That face, those eyes. Dylan felt his blood run cold. It was Jamal Moretti. There he was, standing next to his grandfather, looking straight into the camera lens with an unnerving calm. Not like an innocent child caught up in the criminal world, but more like someone born to understand the rules of the game. Everything started to make more sense in Dylan's mind, as if pieces were being arranged in their rightful order. This was why Jamal never reacted when bullied. This was why he didn't get angry, didn't fight back, wasn't afraid. Because he never needed to. He didn't need to lash out like the weak ones trying to break free from oppression. He didn't need to scream, to threaten, or prove anything to anyone. Jamal only needed to observe, wait, and then, when the time was right, he struck. Not with violence, not with fists, but with fear. A fear that couldn't be measured, couldn't be fought, couldn't be stopped, because it didn't come from the outside. It came from within the prey themselves. Dylan felt his stomach twist. He had never felt like this before. He had always been the one to control the game, the one to choose the target, the one who set the rules and forced others to obey. But now, he was on the other side of the board, and the scariest thing was that he didn't know when it all started. When did he walk into Jamal's trap? Was it when he spilled the kid's food tray on the lunchroom floor? Was it when he tore up his notebook in the middle of class? Was it when he saw him walk down the hallway with that indifferent attitude? Or was it from the very first moment he chose Jamal as his target, not knowing he was up against someone even more dangerous than himself? He slowly lifted his eyes from the paper, but in that instant he realized Jamal was still standing there. Still with those calm eyes, still with that strange serenity. No anger, no triumph, no look of someone enjoying victory. Just absolute certainty. A certainty that made Dylan feel as if someone had just squeezed the breath out of him. Jamal didn't need to do anything. Didn't need to say a word. Because Dylan had already defeated himself. All the psychological games he had used to control others, all the tactics he had employed to make the weaker ones kneel before him, all of those things were now turning back on him. The way he had made others afraid, now he was the one trembling in that fear. For the first time in his life, he understood what it was like to be hunted. For the first time in his life, he was no longer the one in control. For the first time in his life, he understood that he had lost. Jamal looked at him for one more second, as if engraving the image in his mind. Then he turned and walked away, not in a hurry, not looking back. But even after Jamal had left the parking lot, even after his shadow had disappeared into the night, Dylan remained standing there, frozen, his heart pounding with fear. And he knew this fear would never go away. Lorenzo Moretti had taught his grandson one thing. You don't have to beat someone to win. If you know how to play, they'll destroy themselves. And right now, standing in the cold parking lot, his hand still trembling as it gripped the old newspaper, Dylan Carter realized he had walked right down that path. No one needed to hit him. No one needed to threaten him. He had destroyed himself. You think I'm kidding? Jamal didn't raise his voice, nor did he show any signs of threat. But it was the calmness in his words that caused Dylan to feel his entire body freeze for a moment. He felt a chill run down his spine, as if an invisible hand was gripping him, leaving no marks but making every cell in his body scream that he was in danger. Dylan Carter had never known this feeling before. He had made many people afraid. He had seen the weak tremble before him, those who tried not to let tears fall when he pushed them to the ground, those who bowed their heads in silence when he humiliated them. But never before had he been the one standing on the other side. He had never understood what real fear was, until now. He instinctively took a step back, but his legs felt as if someone was holding them tightly, making them heavy. He couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't glance around to find an excuse to deny that he was terrified. Jamal didn't need to do anything. He didn't need to lay a hand on him. Just by standing there, just by observing, just by making Dylan drown in his own obsession, he had broken him completely. Dylan swallowed, but his throat felt dry as if the air around him had been sucked away. He tried to find his voice, but when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. Jamal didn't take his eyes off him. There was no mocking, no expression of satisfaction, no hint of excitement in watching someone else gradually lose control. Because this wasn't a game. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a battle of wits. This was a sentence. Dylan had played with other people's minds, had made the weaker ones fall with just a few words, a glance, a shove against the wall to drown them in fear. But he never imagined that when he himself became the prey, that fear would feel so real and merciless. He felt his heartbeat pounding painfully. Each beat echoed like a drum in his head, overwhelming all reasonable thoughts. No way, this couldn't be real. He couldn't be losing like this. Dylan had once thought that violence was the strongest tool, that with a fist he would always be the ruler, that no one could touch him if he knew how to use power to control everything around him. But he was wrong. Violence meant nothing. Fear was the strongest weapon. And Jamal Moretti didn't just understand that, he was its embodiment. Dylan opened his mouth, trying to say something, but his voice was weak and broken, as if he didn't even believe what he was about to say. Whoa, what do you want? Jamal tilted his head, his gaze unchanged, but for a brief moment, something flickered in his smile. Disappointment. Not disappointment because Dylan had said something wrong, but because Jamal didn't need him to ask that question. Jamal slowly took a step forward. Dylan instinctively stepped back. He hated himself for it. Hated that he was reacting just like the weaklings he once despised. Jamal lowered his voice, not threatening, not warning, just a simple sentence. You already know. No explanation. No justification. Because Dylan already knew the answer. His mind started to spin. Memories from the past few weeks rushed back like a slow-motion film in his head. The bullying he thought had no consequences. The laughter he thought was harmless. The jokes he thought would be forgotten with time, but they hadn't been forgotten. Jamal remembered everything. And now Dylan was paying the price. Dylan suddenly realized that he no longer felt cold. Not because the air around him had warmed up, but because he could no longer control his breath. Fear had completely gripped him, tightening around his chest, pushing him into a depth of feeling he had never experienced before in his life. He had thought Jamal would react like every other weakling had. He had thought Jamal would get angry, would fight back, would scream, would try to prove himself by using the same violence he had used to control others. But no. Jamal didn't need violence. He just needed to look at him. Just needed to plant a question in his mind. Do you know what it feels like to be hunted? Now he knew. Dylan Carter, the one who once believed he was the ruler of Westwood High, the one who thought no one could touch him, the one who thought he couldn't be hurt, was now facing the greatest fear of his life. The fear of realizing that he no longer controlled anything. Jamal stepped back, turned around, and walked away slowly but surely. He didn't need to look back, didn't need to say anything more, because it was over. But Dylan knew. Even when Jamal had left. Even when he no longer appeared before him. Even when he tried to forget what had happened, this fear would never go away. Because once someone has stared directly into the abyss of real fear, they can never return to who they were before. The next morning, Dylan Carter walked into school with a heavy feeling clinging to him, as if the air around him had changed in a way he couldn't control. The brightly lit hallways, the neatly aligned lockers on either side, the chattering voices of students, all seemed the same as any other day, but for him, the world was no longer the same. He didn't need to look around to know that Jamal Moretti was somewhere in the school, and that made him feel suffocated. The feeling was nameless, undefinable, just a presence that weighed heavily on his mind. He had never noticed Jamal before. He was just a shadow, someone insignificant, someone Dylan could step on without thinking twice. But now, just thinking about Jamal sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't because he could beat him. It wasn't because he had threatened him with words or fists. It was because Jamal didn't need to do anything at all, just being there, just looking at him. And that made Dylan feel like he had lost, completely. He tried to act normal, tried to stride down the hallway as if nothing had happened, but he knew he wasn't himself anymore. The feeling of certainty, power, and confidence had vanished. The people who had once bowed their heads to him, the ones who had once feared him, now looked at him with wary eyes. He could feel it. They could smell his fear. Dylan entered the classroom, and his eyes immediately darted to a corner of the room. Jamal was still sitting there, at the back row, as always. But today, no one dared to look at him. Not even the ones who had stood by Dylan. Not even Brandon, Kyle, and Sean. They all kept their heads down. Dylan gripped the strap of his backpack, trying to pretend that nothing had changed, but he knew everything was different now. No more gossiping, no more mocking laughter behind Jamal's back, no more sneering looks or meaningless jokes. No one dared touch him anymore. He glanced over to where Kyle was sitting, his face anxious, as if wanting to say something but not daring to. Finally, it was Dylan who spoke first. No one's going to say anything about yesterday? His voice was low and gruff, but deep down, he already knew the answer. No one in the group wanted to bring it up. No one dared. Kyle didn't answer, only quietly stared at the desk, tracing meaningless circles on the wood with his fingernail. Ryan didn't even bother to look up, his vacant stare fixed on an open book on the desk without reading a single word. Sean was the only one who spoke, but his voice was so quiet that Dylan had to lean in to hear clearly. "What do you think we can do now?" Dylan stared at Sean, not believing what he had just heard. "What do you mean?" Sean sighed, shaking his head as if he couldn't accept this himself. "Jamal isn't like the other guys." Kyle shuddered slightly. Ryan bit his lip, his fingers gripping the edge of his book so tightly it creased the paper. Dylan felt anger rising in his chest. No, he couldn't accept this. He couldn't accept that his entire group, the ones who had never hesitated to bully anyone, was now afraid of some kid who hadn't even laid a finger on them. He leaned his elbows on the desk, his eyes burning with anger. But deep down, there was undeniable confusion. "We can't just let him win like this." Ryan let out a dry laugh, but it was void of any humor. "So, what are you going to do, Dylan?" He didn't know. That was the problem. He didn't know. For the first time in his life, he couldn't figure out how to regain control. He could punch someone, threaten someone, shove someone into a corner and make them afraid with his fists. But with Jamal, none of that worked. Because Jamal wasn't afraid of him. Never had been. And now, Dylan was the one who was afraid. Dylan walked out of the classroom. Ryan, Kyle, and Sean following behind him, but no one said a word. Everything felt heavier than ever. It felt like an invisible shadow was following him. Not real, but still present. Every minute, every second. Then he saw Jamal. He was walking toward him, his step steady, his gaze as calm as it always was. And what made Dylan feel more terrified than anything was that Jamal didn't have any intention of stepping aside. He realized that it was him who had to step out of the way. And then, before he could think any further, his legs automatically moved aside. Jamal walked past, not looking at him, not mocking him, not saying a word, but that was even scarier than anything. Dylan Carter, who had once been the source of fear for so many, who had believed that no one could touch him, was now the one who had to lower his head. And his nightmare still wasn't over. Because Dylan couldn't forget what had happened. He couldn't forget Jamal's gaze. He couldn't forget the feeling of realizing that he was no longer the one in control. And most importantly, he couldn't forget that it was he himself who had put himself in this situation. Because as Jamal's grandfather had once said, "You don't need to hit someone to win. If you know how to play, they'll destroy themselves." Dylan hadn't believed it, but now he did. Jamal sat at the back row of the classroom, quietly staring at the notebook in front of him. He wasn't writing anything, nor reading anything. He simply sat there, silent, calm as always. But this time, the whole world had changed. In the past, when he entered the class, there were always giggles, sarcastic whispers, disdainful looks, mocking glances from Dylan and his gang. But today, there was nothing. No one said anything. No one dared look back at him. No one dared to mock or joke. Because Jamal Moretti had won. Not with fists, not with violence, but by making the bullies drown in their own fear. The atmosphere in the classroom, once noisy and chaotic, now felt suffocatingly heavy. Those who had once bullied now sat motionless like shadows, trying not to do anything that could attract Jamal's attention. Dylan sat still in the middle row, saying nothing. He was no longer the center of every conversation as before. No longer leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, mocking like a ruler. No more nudges to provoke Kyle or Sean into their next cruel prank. Today, he was simply an anonymous face in the crowd, and the worst thing for someone like Dylan Carter was not losing. It was being forgotten. Ryan didn't look up from his book. Kyle scribbled in his notebook, his messy handwriting as if he were just pretending to focus. Sean pursed his lips, occasionally glancing at Dylan as if waiting for some command, but nothing came. Because Dylan could no longer give orders. He was no longer above others. He no longer controlled anything. Dylan could clearly feel the stares around him. Not admiration, not fear like before, but disdain. Those who had stood by him, who had supported him, who had joined in his bullying, now turned their backs. No one said it, but everyone knew he had lost. For so long, Dylan thought his power came from his fists, from threats, from the ability to make others fear him. But now he realized where real power came from control. And when he lost control, he had nothing left. No one feared him anymore. No one followed him. No one stood by his side. He was left alone, completely isolated in the very kingdom he once ruled. He didn't need Jamal to hit him. He didn't need Jamal to humiliate him in front of everyone. Because Jamal had done something far scarier. He had made Dylan destroy himself. The bell rang, signaling break time. Students slowly stood up, some whispering to each other, some walking quickly to the door to head to the cafeteria. No one noticed Dylan. No one stopped to wait for him like they used to. He slowly stood up, feeling as though he existed in a world that no longer belonged to him. And then he saw Jamal. He stood up from his seat, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and walked out of the classroom with complete calm. Dylan couldn't take his eyes off him, because he realized he was waiting for something. A threat, a provoking look, some sign that Jamal still cared about him. But there was nothing. Jamal didn't even glance at him, not because he wanted to ignore him, but because Dylan no longer mattered, and that was worse than any punishment he could ever imagine. Dylan walked slowly down the hall, head lowered, hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets. Before, he always walked with an air of arrogance, with steady steps, with the confidence of someone who knew he was always the strongest in the room. But today, he just wanted to disappear. He passed by groups of students laughing and joking, but their laughter no longer belonged to him. The looks were no longer directed at him. And in that moment he realized his nightmare would never end. No one feared him anymore. No one cared about him anymore. Jamal didn't need to seek revenge, didn't need to prove anything, because Dylan Carter had already lost himself. Jamal Moretti still sat at the back row of the classroom, as always, but today everything had changed. He didn't need to do anything else, didn't need to say anything more, because the battle was over. Dylan Carter had lost, not with fists, not with face-to-face confrontations, but with something far scarier, the fear from within himself. By making him understand what it felt like to be hunted, by making him realize he was no longer the strongest, by making him realize that Jamal Moretti was never prey. He had never been prey. Jamal just smiled slightly, then continued looking at the notebook in front of him. Not in a hurry. No need to prove anything, because he had won. No need for violence, just make the enemy destroy themselves. The teachings of Jamal's grandfather, Lorenzo Moretti. The Reaper, echoed in his mind, every word carved deeply into his memory. He didn't need to repeat it, he didn't need to think about it, because now he understood it fully. Jamal sat there at the back of the class, as he always did. He quietly turned the page of his notebook, his pen gliding across the paper with absolute calm. No one spoke to him, no one dared to look at him. No one saw him as weak anymore. But more importantly, no one dared to mention Dylan Carter anymore. No one cared about who he used to be, what he had done, or how he had once controlled this school. Because now, he was nothing. Dylan Carter sat in a corner of the classroom, his head hung low, eyes fixed on the open notebook before him, unable to read a single word. He no longer sat at the center, no longer held power, no longer had followers waiting for his signal. He just sat there, quietly, alone, as if he had never existed. No one asked him anything. No one teased or feared him anymore. No one cared about him. He had been forgotten. And that was more terrifying than any punishment he could have imagined. When someone lives on the fear they instill in others, when someone exists by controlling the weak, being stripped of that power is the slowest, most painful death. Dylan had once thought the worst nightmare was being defeated in a public confrontation, being humiliated in front of a crowd, being brought down by Jamal in front of everyone. But he was wrong. The real nightmare was no one caring whether he existed or not. Jamal stood up when the bell rang for recess. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out of the class with his usual composure. The class stayed seated, but something strange had happened. No one blocked his path anymore. No one dared to laugh when he passed by. The students who had once stayed silent while Jamal was bullied, those who had pretended not to see when Dylan and his group played their cruel games, now stepped aside when Jamal walked past. Not because they were afraid, but out of respect. No one said it, but everyone understood. Jamal had won. And he had done it without throwing a single punch. But more than that, he had taught everyone a lesson that no one at the school would ever forget. Violence is not the way to win. Controlling fear is what matters most. Dylan walked into the hallway, his eyes scanning as if searching for something. A glimmer of hope. Someone still believing in him. An opportunity to regain his position. But all he received was emptiness. Ryan, Kyle, and Sean were no longer following him. Not because they feared Jamal, but because they had realized Dylan was no longer strong. Once fear is stripped away, once authority crumbles, the former ruler becomes a ghost. Dylan saw Jamal standing at a distance, talking to a few other students. Not as a threat, not as someone seeking power. He simply stood there, natural, comfortable, as if nothing had ever happened. Jamal didn't need to do anything. And that was what drove Dylan mad, because it meant Jamal had never seen him as a threat from the start. Dylan clenched his fist, his fingers turning white with anger. But then he loosened his grip. It didn't mean anything anymore. The battle was over, and he was the loser. Jamal sat under the tree in the schoolyard, the sunlight gently brushing against his hair as he opened a small book. But his eyes weren't fully focused on the words. He remembered his grandfather's teachings, Lorenzo Moretti, the man who had stood in dark alleys with a gun in hand, the one who spread fear without ever pulling the trigger. Violence is the tool of a fool. A smart person doesn't need to throw a punch. They only need to ask questions and let their opponent find the answer that scares them the most. Jamal didn't need to hit Dylan. He only needed to make him face himself. Dylan had driven himself down this path. He had spread fear, and it was that very fear that had consumed him. Jamal simply showed him something he had never thought about. He was never really strong. Because true strength doesn't need to prove itself to anyone. Jamal closed the book, took a deep breath, and stood up. His life at Westwood was no longer the same. He was no longer the prey. He was no longer the outsider, the easy target for anyone looking for someone to bully. He was no longer invisible, someone others could look down on. But he wasn't a ruler either. He didn't want to be another Dylan. Didn't want to rule through fear. Didn't want to walk with others bowing before him. Because Jamal Moretti didn't need that. He only needed one thing: respect. And he had earned it, in a way that no one could forget. No need for violence. Just make the enemy destroy themselves. Jamal Moretti proved that the cruelest revenge is not violence, but making the enemy destroy themselves. Dylan Carter, from a school ruler, became a shadow of himself. No one feared him anymore. No one respected him. No one stood by him. Because true strength doesn't come from fists, but from the ability to control fear. So, what do you think is the best way to deal with bullies? Do you think psychological warfare is the most effective method, or is there another way to reclaim respect without violence? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next exciting content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next stories on Hope Stories.